My name's Dr. Alex Snow. It's my 5th year in the Religious Studies program here at WVU, and though I teach a spectrum of courses in religious studies, I mostly teach in the traditions of the East, so India, China, and Japan. If mindfulness is a fad, it's a very, very old fad, so I'll put it that way. I want to suggest, at least in the context of what I know, that it's a very old tradition, at least in the East. I know that there's also a very old tradition that we might recognize in the West of prayer and meditation in relationship to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but I'll let others speak to that. What I would like to recognize in the East is that we oftentimes associate mindfulness, I think, these days with Buddhism. That may or may not be the case. Before I say something specifically about Buddhism, I'd like to suggest that mindfulness has really, really ancient roots that come before that. So though we'll talk briefly about a Buddhist tradition today, the idea of mindfulness goes back to the Vedas, in which these ancient Indian texts tell us to pay attention. It goes back to these ancient texts in India called the Upanishads, which literally, when translated, mean to turn inward and to pay attention to your mind. These traditions go back to a text like the Bhagavad Gita, in which someone like Krishna gives a teaching to a prince like us. His name is Arjuna, and tells him at one point in time or another to sit down, cross his legs, close his eyes, and count his breath, or essentially to pay attention. This turns into yoga in India. There's also traditions that fall into Tibet and China and Japan. So there's a tradition in Tibet called Rigpa, which the Dalai Lama would associate something with the idea of a clear mind. There's something in China called Mushin, which might sound paradoxically odd, but it literally means no mind or empty mind. And then lastly, I think for Americans, we really recognize the idea of Zen in Japan. This idea of meditative, constant paying attention to what's happening in our mind. All right. To me, backwards and forwards, that all comes from a particular tradition in India, in early Buddhism, called Vipassana meditation. So right before the historical figure of the Buddha dies, his disciples ask, what should we do after you're gone? Classic question in religious studies. You're no longer here to give us an example, so what should we do? And it's nice for us because he puts it in numbers. So it's something called 3 teachings that we need to pay attention to, 5 skandhas, which I'll explain momentarily, and something called the 4 foundations. And the 4 foundations is what we're really talking about. So very, very quickly, Vipassana meditation says, everything around us, the world, my body, your body, the camera, the chair, everything is in constant motion. Everything's impermanent. Even though we don't recognize it, there's plenty of stuff in Western history, Heraclitus, in Greek philosophy and physics and everything else that wants to suggest that this might be the case as well. In the East, it's fundamentally imperative that we recognize that everything is impermanent. If that's the case, in early Buddhism, they will suggest that there are 5 reasons why we do and don't recognize that impermanence. These 5 reasons are called skandhas. In English, though this isn't perfect, it's kind of like our 5 senses. And in more ways than one, Buddhists will say that we have 5 portals, 5 ways that information comes into our body. We see, smell, hear, taste, and touch. But that those 5 portals, what they call 5 skandhas, actually mislead us into believing that what we see is the case, that what we smell is the case. For a philosopher, this might be something like Kant's dusting on Zeke, the thing in itself. Our senses lead us to believe that that's the case. According to the Buddha, near the end of his life, and then later early Buddhist teachings, what we need to do is something called the 4 foundations. So before I give them to you, the 4 foundations are essentially summed up by a phrase, and the phrase means sustained awareness. We could joke about all of our attention spans these days if we want to, about the idea of sustained awareness. But what they're taking up is, right before the Buddha dies, he gives a final teaching and he says, all things are impermanent, just like my body, and we need to observe this carefully and constantly. What's interesting about this is the carefully part's easy. Western science, telescopes, microscopes. We look at things carefully. But the hard part is the constantly part. So, the Buddha says, you need to do 4 things. You need to have sustained awareness, if you want to have mindfulness, of your mind. And you need to have sustained awareness of the sensations of your mind. Third, you need to have sustained awareness of your body. And fourth, you need to have sustained awareness of the perceptions of your body. So maybe in classic Cartesian sense, the Buddha says, we need to have sustained awareness, not just careful, but constant, of our mind and our body. In that context, Buddhism, Hinduism before it, Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese traditions, and then their inclusion into Western culture have suggested that there's something important about mindfulness. Mindfulness doesn't lead to the truth. Mindfulness doesn't lead to perfection. Mindfulness doesn't necessarily lead to being a good person. Mindfulness teaches us that things around us are not as permanent as we'd like them to be. And Buddhism and other Asian traditions simply suggest that we might be better off personally in our own lives and politically and socially in our interaction with other people if we're mindful of that constant change and impermanence.